Welcome to the Three Presbyteers. I'm Josh Owen, pastor at Spruce Creek Presbyterian Church. And Robert, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll let Aaron introduce himself, and then get us rolling with our subject matter.
Yes, I'm Robert Rothwell, associate pastor here at Spruce Creek PCA, associate editor of Table Talk magazine, and a resident adjunct professor for Reformation Bible College.
I am Aaron Garriott, also associate pastor here at Spruce Creek with a emphasis on church planting, and also serve at Ligonier as an associate editor for Table Talk and a professor there at RBC as well. And this episode, we are going to be discussing the topic of Christian faithfulness in a digital world, with a particular emphasis on guidance for parents as we seek to navigate how to best parent our children in a world that is dominated, we might say, by digital media and technology. Now, we might push back on the idea that our age is a more distracted age than before. Certainly Christians have always had temptations of distraction and things of that sort. But I think it's safe to say that Christians have never lived in a world before quite like this, where the amount of digital technology that surrounds us is so ubiquitous. And so this presents particular challenges for Christians. Challenges that I think, for the most part, many of us who've grown up, in the 80s, 90s, for Josh, who grew up in the 40s, we haven't had to deal with these questions as much because we've kind of just adopted these technological advances without asking particular questions. And I think many of us are beginning to ask these questions. We look at the world around us and think, did we actually agree to have a world that is so digitally dominant? And, looking at these things biblically, we might wonder, how did we get here? How did we get to the place where we are so dominated by our phones, our iPads, other devices, computers? How did we get to the place where our kids expect to be entertained by digital devices in a way that previous generations didn't have to deal with these things? For fun, as a kid growing up in the early 90s, we were outside all day, every day. Now it's hard to get kids to go outside to play. And because of that, I think Christian parents have a difficult time not being legalistic on the one hand, but on the other hand, seeking to provide guidance for their children for how they navigate a digital world. So one of the verses that I'd like to open with is what Paul says to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and specifically here, verse 18. I'll read it here. Paul says, and this is the subject of, as you know, Sinclair Ferguson's podcast with Ligonier, Things Unseen. And what Paul says here is he tells these Corinthian Christians to look to the things that, not the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. And so the question I want to ask here from this perspective is, do these digital devices, phones, computers, TV, do they permit us to look to the things that are unseen? Or do they draw our eyes downward to consider the here and the now, the entertaining, the fast, and the flashy? What would you guys say to that?
Yeah, I would have to say the latter. And that's not to say that, this new technology can't be a very useful tool for the church and for education and for edifying things. But what I observe as I look around is that it is primarily being used, especially by young people, as a distraction. Now they use it for education too.
Yeah.
I give them that. They use it for, but there's a danger, I think, even in thinking that these technologies can be used for education and information, and as just something neutral. And I think you'll probably get into this a little later as maybe we'll talk about Neil Postman
Yeah.
And how media influences how we can even have conversations about things.
And make eye contact and things
Sure.
of that sort.
Well, I don't know offhand who the person was that said it, right? But someone said that the medium is the message.
Yeah, Marshall McLuhan.
McLuhan, okay.
Yeah, who taught Neil Postman that we'll get into later. Yeah.
Okay.
And what does McLuhan mean by that, Robert?
Well, I think what he means is that, we can't think that the medium is neutral.
Yeah.
That the way in which something comes to us, and we're talking specifically about digital media here, but you could say this about whether it's a book, a traditional television show, a radio program, that medium invariably is going to have a shaping influence on that message.
Yeah.
Especially if the people who are creating the content are not cognizant of that. So this is why, Josh said that this technology can be used for good ends, and it can be, and it should be, right? So no one is saying here, unplug the internet and throw away your computer. I don't know, maybe sometimes I feel like I want to say that.
Some people might need to do that.
But that's true. But even though this stuff can be used for good, while it's being used for good, it is shaping the way we're thinking about the good.
Amen. Well said. There's many challenges that we could discuss of living in a digital age as a Christian. I want to talk about 3 of those challenges today. And Josh mentioned one of those. And the first challenge is that of preoccupation or distraction. Mm-hmm. And what I'm talking about here is just how distracting digital technology can be without our even knowing that we are being distracted by these things. So the Christian life has never been easy, but perhaps it's never been as distractible as it is today. The ordinary rhythms of the Christian life, for instance, weekly corporate worship, daily prayer, communion with God and His Word, fellowship with His people, all of these things, when you compare them to, say, Netflix or YouTube or Instagram, TikTok, whatever the digital medium is, the weekly rhythms of the Christian life aren't as sexy as those things. Mm-hmm. They aren't as entertaining as those things. And so especially for our children, as we're raising our children, to give our children the option of, say, YouTube or listening to a sermon, children are generally going to pick listening or watching to a YouTube or TikTok video. Mm-hmm. And so as Christians, especially as Christian parents, we need to be aware of the peculiar distractions that this digital world introduces for our children. What are some ways you guys have seen that and ways that we can mitigate those distractions perhaps for our children?
Well, I mean, how have we seen it? I mean, there's any number of things, both of people that I might know personally and others I might not. But one example, and I think a lot of people who are tuning in will probably relate to this, is you go into a restaurant and you see a family sitting there having dinner together. Yeah. And everybody is on their phone.
You know what that's called? There's a word for it now.
Oh, is there?
It's called phubbing.
Phubbing?
Phone snubbing.
Ah.
Yeah.
See?
Phubbing.
But, I think that's just a telling thing, right? Because normally in the past you would be talking to one another, or maybe the kids would be coloring and the parents are talking to each other, and so that's an example. I do think that I can't measure this quantitatively, but I would think that attention spans are just a little shorter, at least, than they were perhaps 10, 15 years ago.
But back to the phubbing, Robert, there's a whole world out there that we need to attend to. So every beep or vibration on our phone requires our immediate attention. Whereas our children are sitting there yearning for communion and fellowship with their parents. And yet, how often do we see parents on their phones and devices rather than giving their time and their affection to their children?
Yeah.
And so that's I would say a gentle rebuke to us Christian parents. Be aware that your children are taking note of these things.
Yeah. And I think it's important that you bring it to we Christian parents, because I know that it is easy, right? It's easy at home. You've had a hard day at work to pull up your phone and you're watching a video. It might be a great video, or it might be a very sound theological video.
It might be this podcast.
It might be this podcast, in fact. No. But and then maybe you have your child sitting next to you watching it with you, and you can start to think of, oh, well, this is time well spent, right? And I'm not saying that would never be appropriate, but is it something like that time well spent? And when I say this, I'm pointing fingers at myself, because I know that all too often I have allowed myself to disengage because, frankly, it's easier to watch a video than to do anything else.
Yeah, I think one way to combat the distraction that this media can be, the preoccupation with this that interferes with our actual relationships with other people, is to use it intentionally. Not necessarily to say I'm going to not use it at all, but to be intentional when we use it. Just a simple what we call screen time. Screen time shouldn't be all the time, and I think that's the danger, is we don't put it away.
Yeah,
it's in our pocket all the time, and any time that my mind is just slightly bored, it comes out and just start looking at whatever, if it's scrolling through videos or pictures and whatever it is, and it could be even just pulling up the news app, like an obsession with just having to constantly check this or that. Whatever the particular app is, but it's always there.
Which are designed to keep you scrolling.
Yes,
right.
They're actually designed with that intent in mind.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, they're intentional about what they're putting before us to keep us occupied with that. And as long as they're successful in keeping us, so we have to be intentional to say, I'm going to use this, but I'm going to use it from here to here, and I'm not going to be pulling it out of my pocket when I am with my family, when I'm hanging out with my friends, when I'm standing in line at the grocery store. I'm not going to be flipping through my phone, because if my head is up and I'm looking around, I may see someone that I know. Lo and behold, and I could actually, interact with a human being, rather than just basically, when you're looking at that screen, you're telling everyone around you, don't bother me.
I'm in a different world right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's the distractions of life that digital technology can introduce. The second danger that I would like to acknowledge is what we might call persuasion. And what I'm talking about here is really those covert lies that technology and even the marketing juggernauts are pushing their products in ways that are intentionally taking us captive. Like Facebook being designed so that our eyes keep scrolling down and our thumbs keep scrolling up, so that we keep our eyes fixed on these things. They seek to take us captive by vying for our attention and even for our affections in ways that we as Christians might not even recognize. The effects that these things are having on our hearts. And so this is what requires that digital discernment, Josh, that you're talking about. These devices, these technologies might be tools that we can use, but they're tools that we are to steward rather than allowing this technology to steward us. We own these devices rather than these devices owning us. And I suspect that many times we flip that, at least practically speaking. And so we're in dangerous waters, I think, when we begin to accept any and all new media uncritically. And we've been susceptible to that
Sure.
and lining up for the newest iPhone or for the newest iPad or for whatever new device is out there, we don't stop to critically assess whether this tool is necessary. And we bypass the digital discernment questions here that we'll get into at the end. And so we can get into all sorts of things about marketing companies wanting to sell us their products and giving us lies. Even what Elon Musk is talking about recently with Googling certain things like President Donald, and Google doesn't bring up Donald Trump. It brings up Donald Duck, Ronald Reagan, all of these different.
Donald Reagan.
Yeah, Donald Reagan.
Donald
And so, whether all of this is true or not, I think we can all acknowledge that these media companies that often don't share our agenda have their own agenda that's hidden.
Sure.
And so how do we teach our people and our children how to assess these things and be discerning in this type of a world?
Yeah. Well, I kind of, came up in big time sitcom era. And, one of the things that you go back and you look at these old sitcoms, and you remember all the clap tracks and the laugh tracks that are supposed to cue you. That was funny. You're supposed to laugh at that.
Yeah.
These people are like stars of the show. So when they come out, you should be like, oh, really paying attention because, there's something really, funny or good is about to happen on the show. And all this is communicated to you just through them playing a clap track.
Yep.
Oh, everybody's clapping. So, okay.
We should do that, Gabe. We should implement that in our show.
And the persuasion that's supposed to have is laugh at these kind of things.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you'll be watching these shows with kids, and sometimes it's just because the kids aren't mature enough to even understand the humor. Okay, you get that. But there's other times where the kids are plenty mature enough, and they're just looking at that and they're going, "That wasn't funny," and they don't understand the whole laugh track thing. So they're just like, "Why is everybody laughing?"
Yeah.
Well, nobody's really laughing.
Yeah.
They're just trying to tell you that that's something you should find funny. They want you to find that funny.
Well, the what you just say there brought to mind that they're telling us what to laugh at. The sitcoms were right. Well, and this happened, of course, in the television ages too, but especially in the digital world, they're telling us what to love.
Yes.
Right. And just the way stories are brought to us now on topics in quick succession, the headlines used, the nice video of the sympathetic person who might be in a very serious sin, but they're just very sympathetic because people have made fun of them their whole life for, we could fill in a blank. But all of that stuff, that is designed to teach you to love what is being presented.
And to elicit some emotions.
And but one, as I'm saying that, one thing that comes to mind is, we know that, right? We know that. So and I'm very careful with it. So maybe some people, maybe it's teaching them how to love, but I'm strong enough to resist that. I can imagine there might be somebody, maybe we're thinking it here at the table. Is that true?
I'm not buying the lie that they're selling, but we are without even knowing it.
Yeah.
How many times have we gone past a billboard and coveted, or a house and coveted that person's house? What we're doing there is we're buying the lie that it's selling. And that is, if you have this, you'll be happy. If you have this device, you'll be happy. If you give this device to your children, you'll have more free time. If you can go on the other side of things. If you buy land and go off grid, you'll be happy. All of these are covert lies that these juggernauts, really Satan is selling us through these various advertising agencies in order to get us to buy a bill of goods that we come to find out on our deathbed was a lie altogether.
I don't know much about this. Aaron, probably better prepared. But one of the things that seems to me when we're thinking about the issues of persuasion is a lot of this social media seems to run on algorithms that keep you sort of in your little neck of the woods with people who are like you. They're feeding you things that make the world that you're living in online seem like your world. This is my world. But if you were to walk out your door and start talking to your neighbors, you would realize, wow, my world that I actually live in is much bigger,
Yes.
much broader than this little online community that I've discovered because my social media keeps feeding me stuff that's like me. You
Yes.
know, and so again, it is, in one sense, it's persuading you. It can be simply reinforcing, right, your own biases,
Yes.
and even further cutting you off from the people who are actually physically right there at your fingertips, you know, and maybe keeping you from having relationships with your actual neighbors, people who might be your friends.
Absolutely. And isn't it ironic that social media, is intended to make us more social? We have thousands of friends on Facebook, but we have less friends than ever who truly know us and love us.
Yes.
And that's the irony about this digital world. And so we have the dangers of distraction. We have the dangers of persuasion. And lastly, I want to mention the visual temptations that this digital world offers. So we could say it's a danger of purity or impurity. And we all know this too. We see things on our phones. We see more skin on our phones that our great-grandparents saw their whole lives, things that would make them blush. And what that does is it conditions us to have a higher level of tolerance for certain visual images that we and our children should not be beholding. And the difficulties, the challenges that this presents for the Christian who is seeking to have a pure and chaste mind and be faithful in a world that is throwing all sorts of images at them in the devices that are even in their pockets. So how is this a particular challenge for Christians nowadays, and especially for children who are being introduced to pornographic images at an earlier age than ever?
Yeah.
It's astounding how early.
And I think you're talking not just about, what you might think of as a explicitly pornographic site, but you're thinking of ads that would pop up that, maybe swimsuit ads or something.
Absolutely.
that are, well, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And it's this is one of the things that, like the safety filters and things that you can put on your web browser and things, which you should do if you have children. You may even need to do it for yourself if it's, for your own sanctification, but they aren't going to screen out even that stuff. So we're still, even if we think we're putting up guards everywhere, and we should put up as many guards as we can, there's still, like you said, there's more skin coming through invariably. And it's not just the internet, we could say. It could be a television program or whatnot. And it does desensitize us.
It does. And that's the goal. That's the goal. Just like the LGBT community is, as an example here, the LGBT community, their goal all along has been to show us enough images of love is love and so forth that we become so desensitized to it that we don't care about it anymore. The same is true with those images. You see enough skin all day, every day. Your mind becomes desensitized to it, and you no longer care about the sin that is coming from your heart through your eyes.
Yeah, and I think in addition to sensual material that's out there, I think is also material that is graphically violent, that used to be censored by television, so that graphic violence, would kind of be tapered until the late night hours, right? So like children wouldn't be exposed to certain images. Even news programs wouldn't show certain footage, even if they had it, they wouldn't show it, simply not to expose all of our children to everything that's happening in their world, right? So as to allow some of that to come to them through the proper channel of their parents, rather than to come directly to them through the news anchor. But that's no longer the case. Now, if you give your child one of these devices and you're not controlling and filtering that. And I don't even know how well the filters really work, but they're getting not only sensual images, they're getting violent images, and then they're getting images of people just doing foolish things. And this is, I think, when you're starting to get into that pre-teen and teen, they're starting to be fed images of people doing foolishly dangerous things. And you know, I'm not one who's risk averse. I think there's a healthy, you know, calculated risk taking that we should encourage with our children. But some of this stuff is really out there. And you know, you're putting this stuff in the hands of your children, and they want to go, they think it's cool because it's presented to them as being cool. But it's foolish. And then they want to go and imitate, you know, this kind of foolish behavior and such. Yeah. So the purity issue, I think there's many dimensions.
It's a big topic beyond just the sexual purity. And, you know, we have to be aware of that. And it's easy to forget that, because as consumers of this stuff, I think we've all been desensitized just living in this culture over the past few decades, at least.
Yeah.
So it's something we really need to all have our antenna up for our children, certainly, but also for our own hearts. And it's you know, we're just going to be honest here. It's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. Just, you know, walk through the mall or grocery store, and, you know, it's difficult. But if we're thinking about it and we know that it's difficult, we can do a better job of preparing ourselves for it.
That's half the battle.
Yeah.
Half the battle is knowing that you and your children are going to be catechized. The question is, who is catechizing your children?
Yeah.
Are they being catechized by the world or by the scriptures? And as faithful Christian parents, we are instructed, and we'll do an episode on, you know, even family worship. We're instructed to catechize our children in the ways of the Lord. And so if we're thinking in those terms, we might come to various disagreements about how to implement these things, what restrictions to put on them. But if we're thinking in those terms, I think we're on the right track. And so there's more dangers we could talk about. Those are 3 specific dangers of living in this digitized world that we find ourselves in: preoccupation, persuasion, and purity. I want to talk just for a few minutes about some guidance we can give for parents, specifically with their children. Because we could fall on the other extreme and think, well, the Amish got it right. We need to be Luddites, just expel every sort of technology ever and try to live in this world without any device, only analog. Well, not only is that untenable, but it might not be wise. But some of us might do well to have a sort of digital detox. And that is to ask some critical questions about whether the tools that we carry around in our tool belt are necessary for our lives. And so we might want to exercise some digital minimalism. There's a book, he's not a Christian, but he's a very profound professor author. His name's Cal Newport. He wrote a book called Digital Minimalism. And what Cal Newport is advocating for here is exactly what the title says. Only use the devices that you think are absolutely necessary to achieve the goals that you want to achieve in life. The problem is most of us don't ask those questions.
Sure.
We just uncritically adopt them. So the first piece of advice that we could give is have a sort of digital minimalism mindset. The second that I want to spend a little more time on is critical adoption. And what we mean by this is be critical about the devices that you are inviting into your life and into your home. And Robert, you mentioned Neil Postman earlier. Neil Postman, who wrote the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, which was written, I think, in the 70s. But if you read Neil Postman in the 70s, it's kind of eerie because it's very prophetic. He's describing what the world is going to look like if we continue to uncritically adopt these devices. And he's describing the world we find ourselves in now.
Yeah.
So it's worth reading, I think. But what Neil Postman does is he advocates for asking particular questions before adopting a device. And the first one he asks is, what problem is this technology seeking to solve? So let's use Facebook as an example here. in filtering Facebook through these questions. What problem is Facebook seeking to solve? Okay, it's trying to connect us with more people.
We live in a transient society.
Yep.
My friends have moved
Mhm.
away,
Yes.
and I want to stay in touch with them. I want to keep up with them.
Good. Yep. So that's
Right.
that's it. Second question is, whose problem is it? Okay, so that's an important question. Is it only certain people that have this problem? Does everybody have this problem? Are all of our friends moving around? Are we all transient? So whose problem is it? Third, what new problem might be created by seeking to solve this problem? So this is kind of the G.K. Chesterton question. Before you tear down a fence, ask the question, why was that fence put up in the first place?
Yes.
What other problems are going to arise by seeking to address and solve this problem? Fourth, which people and institutions will be harmed by this new technology? Which people will be harmed by this new technology? With Facebook, although it might have done some good, I think we could say, by and large, Facebook has had a detrimental effect on the lives of younger people. Yes, maybe it has connected people in a way that might not have been plausible 20 years ago. But there's many books. One is called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt that show the effects, even on things like mental health in children, that social media has had on our children. Why? Because we haven't asked this question. Fifth, what changes in language are being forced by this new technology? That's an interesting one to answer with Facebook. What would you guys say to that? What changes in language has Facebook brought about?
Well, what is a friend?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, if somebody has a few hundred Facebook friends, then your definition of friendship is very different than any classical definition of friend. And by a classical definition of friend, most people have very few. Even a very social person is going to probably only have enough friends that they could count on their fingers and toes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we don't even know what friendship is. And the question is, once you have so watered down the definition of friend, do you then even have the idea of what it means to really be one? And do you even have one?
Yep.
Like real friend?
Yeah.
If this is your idea of friendship.
What is friendship and what is a real conversation?
Yes.
Many of us have been conditioned to having very short conversations because of text messaging and email, where it's very difficult for younger people nowadays, by and large, to have a sustained, reflective conversation where you're making awkward eye contact. So I think we could say that Facebook has changed the way that we view friendship and conversation. Anything you want to add to that, Robert? Before I read the last question, the Postman.
No, I
Yes.
think that's. I'm sure we could think of more, but that's a good.
The sixth question then that Postman asks is, which people and institutions gain economic and political power with the introduction of this technology? Well, he kind of sounds like a conspiracy theorist here, right? Well, no, what Postman is getting at is what we talked about earlier with those covert lies. There's always an agenda that people are pushing.
Yeah.
And most of the time that agenda is driven by power and money. And so for Facebook, who is it that benefits from us constantly scrolling on our phones on the Facebook app? And if you don't ask those questions, I think it was Steve Jobs, actually, who wasn't a Christian, who originally said, if there's not a particular product that's for sale, you are the product. So Facebook's free, doesn't cost us anything. What's the product? Well, we are. That's how Facebook makes money. The more people they get scrolling and the longer they are scrolling, advertisers pay them more money for that. And so this question isn't meant to make us overly skeptical as much as it is to ask the question before we just uncritically adopt these devices into our lives, our homes, and into the lives of our children.
Yeah.
And before we close, anything that you guys want to mention about those 6 questions?
Well, at the risk of sounding like Kamala Harris, if you think about what the meaning of the word amuse is, right? To muse would be to think on something, right? To meditate on it. So if you add that alpha privative, you're not thinking. You're doing something that's designed for you not to. An amusement park, you don't go to it like a library to go and study and learn and think. You go to it to not think. So if we're amusing ourselves to death, then we are literally like using certain technologies to shut the brain down and let something else and someone else do the thinking for us.
Yes.
Hopefully the guy that's operating the amusement park ride is thinking, while I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
And one of Postman's points is that he's not anti-entertainment. What he's anti is that our news has become entertainment, right?
Yeah.
He's thinking more in the television age that rather than reading a full-length journal article that's been well-researched, documented, and then vetted by peers, now we are just getting little sound bites from a talking head on television who's giving us things that has it been fact-checked, has it not been fact-checked, and we're getting these little bullet points, from the anchorman to more or less, say, this is all the information that you need. And we've already put the pieces together for you, so you don't really need to do any more thinking about this. And there you go. That's the news for the day. Well, he's saying that now the news has become amusement. It's become an opportunity not to really critically engage with the events and ideas of our day. And that's because of the way, as you were talking about earlier, the medium has become the message.
Yeah.
And thus we're not being really trained to think as we receive the news in this way. We say shut down, somebody else is doing the thinking for us. And I think that's only increased, right, with more screens, and what we have in our hands, we are really amused. Yeah. We're shutting the brain off from engaged thinking.
And that's bad on so many levels, right? Like, I'm sure many of you who are tuned in are readily we think, the political parties and whatnot, they know this and they're tailoring things and they're putting their own spin on the world and they're doing this all for their benefit. And of course that's true, but when we get so focused on amusement, we start to lose the ability to think rationally, to think carefully. And how is that going to, it's going to make us in this country not very good citizens, because in the United States, the founders designed it so that citizenship would take some work and some reading, frankly. And but we're also going to be not effective Christians, because the life of the mind, right? It's not everything there is to being a Christian, but being able to think theologically, being able to follow an argument that Paul or Peter might make in their epistles, that is essential for your growth in holiness and growth in the Christian life. And when we lose that ability through amusing ourselves to death, then we're in trouble, and we don't even notice it happening. That's the scary thing. So often.
Well said. So the first piece of guidance is digital minimalism. Second is critical adoption. So what we're saying here is you're asking the question, what do I want to achieve? Well, for Facebook, you want to be more connected. Okay. The second question you're asking is Facebook the best tool to achieve that goal? If it's yes, okay. If it's no, look for something else. The third question we're asking is, okay, if it is the best tool to use, if that tool is one I want in my tool belt, how do I use it and when do I use it? So the third principle here then is what we might call a disciplined operation. And that is you're setting guidelines for yourself and for your children, if you're a parent, you're setting guidelines for when you're going to use this tool and how you're going to use it. So for Facebook, maybe I'll use it for 15 minutes a day at this particular time to achieve my goal, rather than allowing yourself the freedom to use it willy-nilly whenever you want, whenever you have a spare moment. Anything you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, screen time is what we used to call it, right? And setting it up for yourself as well as for your kids.
Yeah. And these aren't hard and fast rules. They're more so, they're guiding principles so that we're not owned by these devices.
Yeah. Intentionality. What do I want to get from this device?
Yep.
And like you said earlier, does it own you or do you own it?
Yeah.
Right. So own it.
Yeah.
And earlier you mentioned the how this technology allows us to be in contact with the world, we think anyway, with the world all the time, and then in turn for the world to be in contact for us. So are you saying that it might be okay sometimes to either turn the phone off or silence it so you don't hear every text message, or is that really what you might be suggesting?
You said it for me.
Okay.
You said
So
it
I
for me.
thought.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the things that I would want to say is, don't forget that this world that God created is a marvelous place, and there's so much to explore in your backyard, in your neighborhood, in your town, that you got to get your head out of the screen and start looking around, start appreciating the beauty and the goodness that is all around us, which including the people. Right?
At the beginning, we talked about the distractions of technology. I think before we close, it's worth mentioning that technology can also distract us and desensitize us from the ordinary means of grace. So that now a 45-minute sermon is too much for us, but we're okay binge watching a 3-hour Netflix show. We need to be aware of those for ourselves and for our children.
You don't binge watch my sermons?
I do binge watch your sermons.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, to sleep at night. Secure from something.
White noise.
So we mentioned Neil Postman's book. One other book I think is worth mentioning and endorsing here is J.B. Fesko, who's an OPC pastor and professor at RTS Jackson, has a newer book, probably 4 years old now, called The Christian in Technology. And I think Dr. Fesko there really strikes a good balance in not falling into either error, either ditch, but helping Christians to navigate this digital world in a way that doesn't say no to every device, but doesn't say yes to every device. And I think that's what we're after here. And so I'd like to close with Paul's words to the Ephesians in chapter 5, verse 15 and verse 16, where Paul says, look carefully then how you walk. So look carefully how you use these devices and how these devices use you, how these media companies are seeking to sell you as their products. Look carefully. Not as unwise, but as wise. And then he says, verse 16, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. The old translation, redeeming the time. Making the best use of the time that God has given us because the time that we've been given is for us to steward faithfully. And when it comes to technology, often we allow ourselves to be given over so that it uses our time rather than us seeing time as something God has given us to steward for his glory and for the good of our neighbors. So not only when we're at the grocery store, we might see someone we know, we also might have the opportunity, can you believe this, to meet a new person, to have a conversation with somebody we don't know. And so if we have a proper view of God's providence and how every interaction we have is a divine appointment, as we like to say in evangelicalism, then it allows us to take our heads out of our screens and to enjoy not only God's creation, but God's image bearers that are around us.
Indeed.
Much more could be said. And again, the intention here of us is not to be overly legalistic and to bind people's consciences, but rather to show us the dangers of a digital world and to give us some guiding principles for how Christians can be faithful. And so we hope and pray that this episode was helpful in thinking through these things. And Josh, do you want to land the plane for us?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Three Presbyteers. We hope you'll tune in again.
Seven miles on a dusty road, two men travel with a heavy load. Friendly stranger comes and joins the walk, fills their hearts when he starts to talk. Fills a time with words of truth, they don't yet know who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Troubled woman sits by the well, sinful past as he can tell. Sits and listens to this Jewish man, already knows and he shares a plan. Living water that'll quench her thirst, she doesn't yet know who he is. Walk with the Lord. see. Truth is shown and changed his views. Now he knows and he shares the news. Chief of sinners spreads the word. He knows now who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Living word and the bread of life puts to rest all your worldly strife. He's chosen you before it all. Walk with him and you'll never fall. His yoke is easy and his burden's light. All you need to do is walk. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Gotta walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord.